Yeah, so my current project is called the LSST. That's the Legacy Survey of Space and Time, which is a new telescope that's about 2 years from completion in Chile at a new observatory called the Vera C. Rubin Observatory. It's the first observatory named for a woman ever. And this new telescope takes full advantage of the aspects of data collection and data analysis, which are still not worked out, right? So we built an instrument that can deliver data that we don't yet know how to handle, just at an incredible rate. So it will have the world's most complex and largest digital camera, 3.2 billion pixels. So by comparison, your cell phone has about 1 million. All right, so this will be 3,200 times more powerful than that. And it will take a picture of the entire sky visible every 3 days. And it will keep updating that picture every 3 nights or so for 10 years. And so what you'll have at the end of that 10 years is a digital movie of everything that has changed in the universe over the course of that 10 years, going back literally to very close to the dawn of time, about 13 billion years. So if you can just kind of imagine the volume of the universe and everything that changes within it, going back billions of years, that's all going to be in this data set. And so, as I said, we don't yet have the statistical tools, nor do we have the computer tools yet to actually do that kind of science with a data set that is that large. But it does mean 2 things. So the first is we will develop them. I'm pretty confident of that. And so this data set will be the most powerful in the history of astronomy by far. And will also, because it's all digital, there's nobody's looking through a telescope or taking individual pictures. The pictures themselves will be on the web. And so any citizen anywhere in the world that has an internet connection will actually be able to do science. And they'll be able to query databases that essentially can say, tell me every new thing that appeared in the sky last night. And the database will dump, we think, roughly between 100,000 and 1 million objects onto their desktop. But every new thing that occurred that wasn't there the night before will actually be in a data set that's accessible around the world. To my mind, physics is all about understanding how the universe works. And to complete the story of how it works, you, of course, need to know how it started. And maybe if it has an end, how it ends. There are really fundamental philosophical questions, of course, engaged in those. But as it turns out, there's a really tight connection in physics with mathematics, in that the universe appears to work by mathematical rules. And those rules are really very clear in their message, which is that if you ask what makes the laws laws, that is, why do they always work the way they do? It turns out that the deep mathematical reason for that is because they couple to how things started, right? That in math, you have what are called axioms, right? And so if you're going to build a system of mathematics, it's got to be built upon a set of axioms that you begin with. And if you change those axioms, you actually change the mathematics. That was one of the things that mathematicians of the 19th century realized. But it's the same for physics, that we need to understand the way that the universe began in order to understand why it has the particular laws that it does in mathematical terms, right? And so as opposed to just observations, the world just works this way as an existential argument. If you actually want to couple it to, here is the mathematical reason it has to be the way it is, the beginning is really important for that. So the idea of understanding the origins of the universe are really muddled at this point because we had a really simplistic picture of how it started, and that became a lot more complicated when we realized that those mathematical laws told us that the really simplistic picture we had cannot couple to the way the universe exists now, right? The math just doesn't allow it. And so the question began to be one of, for me, being in a field like particle physics, which was a great field for me to work with accelerators, very large collaborations, really high tech engineering projects. All of that was very interesting to me. But it's clear that it was limited, right? That we're going to get to a point where we can't build more powerful accelerators. They're just too expensive and technically too complex. And we'll need some massive breakthrough in physics in order to develop a technology that allows us to go further. And then on the other hand, this was right at the time, right? Again, 1998, that astrophysics was saying, but wait, you know, this whole coupling to the beginning that we thought was in particle physics doesn't work, right? That's all broken down. And so it was a great time to, and it didn't happen for me right away because it's a big deal to switch your research, right? Your funding goes away. All of the people who know you as an expert, you have to move to a new set of people who don't know you as an expert to learn from them. Language is a tremendous burden because the language you speak it uses the same words, but the meanings and again, the axioms, what you assumed is true on the basis of the use of that word is just really different. But I took a sabbatical. I went to Berkeley and I immersed myself for a year in learning the new language and talking with the people and just loved it. They were very accepting. They treated me like a graduate student at the beginning, and then there was a very fast ramp up to getting expertise in the field. And at that point, I think they also realized that other fields have a lot to offer, other subfields have a lot to offer to the way that astronomy had been done. The move to big data, for example, was a problem that technically we had solved in particle physics. And they literally had not come close to doing that in astronomy or astrophysics. It was shameful, to say the least, how things were done with computers. And so it was literally about 20 years behind. And so we were able to, people in particle physics who moved with our feet, right? We kind of voted to move away from accelerators to telescopes. But we brought with us a lot of techniques about how to work collaboratively in big groups, how to bring really front edge computing technology and sophisticated software and statistics into the study of big data sets. And the technology is at a point where it can actually deliver those. And so the field in and of itself is at this really exciting transition, which is just about to be complete in this next 10 years. That will take us into, hopefully, new ways of connecting the beginning to what we can observe now. But the part of it that seems to me most interesting is that it really isn't disconnected from what we learned from Einstein and Newton. Both of them were great unifiers. That is, they connected what you could observe right now today to things that happened in the very distant past by, again, following that lead from mathematical laws to axioms of how the universe began. And the idea that we're still following a tradition that's nearly 400 years long is, that to me is, I love history. And so it's very exciting to me to think that we're still keeping the best parts of what we have a tradition for, but at the same time dealing with very, very new ways of approaching how to do science in this modern era where computers have become so incredibly powerful. To be honest with you, there's a lot of public interest in this, but I'm an old guy by now, so I can still remember the Apollo moon landings. And living in a Black community, it was not an all positive experience, right? I mean, this was considered to be one of the greatest achievements of humankind. But there were a lot of people who were in the Black community who really thought, why are we spending this money when we could be spending it here, right? And I'm growing up in East St. Louis, which was a very, very poor community at the time, and even more poor now. And so the question of, can we afford to do science? Can we afford to have people making manned trips into outer space? I am very positive about it and very supportive of that as an idea, but I'm very mindful of the fact that all of us need to do a better job of connecting what we do to problems that people actually have to have solved, right? And so I agree that a manned spaceflight is an incredibly empowering thing, right? Between Star Trek and the Apollo program, that really is what got me started around the whole idea of astronomy. And I didn't know about physics at that point, but I discovered astrophysics really just a couple of years after that. And so having the initial excitement, I think, is really terribly important for motivating people, even if they don't wind up doing research in the field. An awful lot of the people that I know, my graduate students, have wound up going into finance, into software industry. They are really smart people who've done really terrific things in a huge number of fields. And even though they started with the motivation in this field, right, having the interest in them going to take what you've learned into other endeavors is important. And it's really hard for us to kind of see what the impact on society has been. But I'm convinced that it's really profound. So we need to do a better job of explaining that to people. And so what I hope is that the interest kind of encourages people, now that you've got their attention, let's tell them something that's actually interesting and useful about why it's not ridiculous to have Jeff Bezos going into space. I really don't care that it's him, but it's the idea that someone who has no special training can be motivated to do something really terrific and really hard to do is the story that we want to get out there. Yeah, so for me, it was an interesting story. I knew from the age of 12 that I wanted to be a research physicist. And so from 7th grade on, that's the focus, right? And I knew that you have to go to graduate school and get a PhD in order to do that. In order to get a PhD that's a good PhD, you have to go to a great undergraduate institution. And I really had no focus on what the institution was. And so all of my academic life has been people saying, we would be interested in having you come here. And that's primarily the reason I came. So that's how I went to Northwestern. A dean came to my high school, had an assembly, and just said, if you want to see Northwestern, just write me a letter and we'll invite you and pay for you to come visit the campus. So in 1975, that's what I did. And it's a beautiful, it still is. There are quite a few more buildings now, but it was a beautiful campus. There used to be an observatory that was right on the extension out into the landfill, out into the lake, that literally looked out on infinity, right? Because there was just the lake and the skyline. And so I was really hooked on it and came. When I came, I said I wanted to be in astrophysics and I wanted to be a physics major. And my advisor, he's probably retired now, I haven't checked, Mel Ulmer, is an astrophysicist. And he said two things to me. So first he said, you shouldn't take physics your first year until you've actually completed all of calculus. which wasn't the best advice, because what he didn't tell me is that you have to double up on all your physics courses in your sophomore year. So I wound up taking first and second year physics courses at the same time. But anyway, the idea of the second thing he told me was that if you're clear that you want to be an experimentalist, this will not be a reputable field for experimentalists for about 2 decades. And he was almost exactly right. The field really made a sea change once the technology got to the point where you could send up real instruments that were very powerful and were able to study the universe as a whole rather than studying just a patch of it. And so that was the mid-90s. But he said, you know, if you really want to get involved in experiment that's at the cutting edge and really doing stuff that we don't know, that is discovering things that we don't know about, you should go down the hall to the particle physicists who are working at Fermilab, which again is about 35 miles west of the campus, 40 miles west of the campus, and just get involved there. So that was my first week, right? My first meeting. I was a fully financial aid student. And so I had a work study position that I had to have. I looked through, there were 400 plus positions. Precisely one of them was in the physics department, and it was with the particle physics group. And so that's kismet, right? I mean, how could fate have determined any better that this is what's for you? Who else is going to want that job anyway? So I showed up for the interview, and I was the last in line of 13. So when I got in, I was interviewed by an engineer who was the lead engineer for the high energy physics group, who designed and built all of the instrumentation. And the interview lasted less than 60 seconds. He basically asked me a bunch of questions. You know, can you design a circuit board? Do you know how to solder? Can you work with integrated circuits? Have you used an oscilloscope? So it was no, 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 no. And at the end of that, he said, I'll call you. And that was the end of the interview. And so I left with my tail between my legs, thinking I was a failure before I'd even taken my first class. And after a week, I got really angry because, of course, he didn't call. And so I screwed up every ounce of courage I had to go back and force him to tell me that I was not worthy of a work study position with the high energy physics group. And I knocked on his door and I stuck my head in, and he says, you're back. I guess you're ready to get started. And I said, well, no, you said you would call. And he said, let me tell you something. There are things that I can teach, and there are things that I can't teach. Every year, a bunch of first-year students come into that door. I ask them a bunch of questions. They don't know how to do any of the things that we need them to do. They're freshmen. Of course, they don't know how to do any of that stuff. I know that. But all of those are things that I can teach. So I tell every one of them, for the things I can't teach, I'll call you. I never call anybody. I hire the first person who comes back. And so I thought, well, that's crazy, because I still don't know anything, but okay, since I'm the first one to come back, I took the job. And in the first week, I met the professor, Gary Rosen, who, I'm sure you haven't met him, but in those days, Jerry stood about 6'6", 6'7", massive. He had a devilish goatee. He smoked cigars in the building, even though you weren't supposed to smoke. And he was, let's just say, a very domineering personality. So he came in and in this booming voice said, I hear we got fresh meat. Where is he? I raised my head and he just pointed to me and said, follow me. And I followed him through tech to a loading dock, as it turns out, that was filled floor to ceiling with 20-foot steel beams and these large bales of gold-plated copper wire. And he turned on the light and he showed this to me. And he said, I want you to take all of this And in 18 months, I want you to have produced for me 24 planar drift chambers for this new experiment that I'm going to put on at Fermilab. And of course, he knew that I had no idea what a planar drift chamber is, let alone how to build one. So his reaction to my mouth gaping was to slap me on the back and say, "Some assembly required," and then he left. And I was lost. I didn't know my way around the building. So it took me 20 minutes to get back to the workshop, the lab. The people who were in there immediately knew what happened and said, "Look, the way you get things done is anything you don't know, you just ask questions and somebody will answer the question. Even if the first person says, 'I don't know,' go away, you ask the next person. Eventually they'll tell you what to do. And this is the way everybody does everything, right? Nobody knows how to build any of these things that we say that we're going to build. There's no textbook that tells you how to do it. No one's ever done it before. That's why it's research. So just keep that in mind and don't tick off the people in the machine shop because they're the ones who teach you how not to cut off your fingers. So I followed that advice, and in the next year and a half, I produced the 24 planar drift chambers along with all the associated electronics, the high voltage cabling, power supplies, the whole thing. And so I knew that the lesson at that point was, yeah, I mean, it's only the people who are crazy enough to keep coming back, despite the fact that the challenge seems overwhelming, is what's necessary, right? That it's not how smart you are, it's not your pedigree. Those things help, but they don't actually determine the difference between success or failure, particularly in scientific research, but I think any kind of academic endeavor. Persistence is the one trait that overwhelmingly is successful. Is that, I'm not an outgoing person by nature, but that has to change when it comes to whatever your interest is, whatever sort of drives you. You have to introduce yourself, right? The one thing that I consistently explain to students is that there's nothing faculty like better than talking about what they do, right? I mean, it's kind of the reason that they're in the field as opposed to any number of other pursuits they might have taken on. So yes, they're busy, and yes, you can feel like you're intruding on them. But once you get the first question in and they start talking about, oh, by God, here's somebody with an interest, you're going to find out an awful lot about what happens. And the important thing in terms of mentorship is it would be terrific if people knew how to mentor, but they don't. And so again, I don't call it an initiative, but one of the things that I'm going to work very hard on this year is putting together workshops that actually talk about what good mentoring looks like. But what we'll start with is new faculty orientation by explaining to new faculty what good mentoring looks like. I wish I could do it for graduate students as well, but I don't have, purview over them. And so the question of what are your expectations really needs to start with just that, right? That you have to make yourself known. And even though it flies in the face of the way that we normally feel, right? I recently talked to one of our professors here who was born and raised in Puerto Rico and says, I speak English very well, but my writing I still think is poor. Right? I'm very shy about writing papers. And he's had a very successful scientific career. But he still says that at meetings, I'm not the first person to put my hand up and try and answer a question or even ask a question. And so no matter how far you go, the imposter syndrome goes with you, but we have to do our best to get ourselves noticed. And if we do more of that, right, on the student side, I know it's hard to say that to students because they're expecting that the adults are going to make it easier for them. And it's not that they don't want to, it's that they have not been trained that this is what you have to do. If there's anything that sticks in the white male mentality, particularly with the US, it's that, every man thinks that he raised himself by building his own log cabin, right? We all think that we did it on our own, and we have to be, I think, almost forced to sit down and think, who are the people that really helped us? And so if somebody asks us the question and we go through our minds, who are our mentors? It comes to us, but it's not the first thing that we tend to think of, right? Particularly in the quantitative fields. We kind of think of having discovered our ability to do this, or languages, any of these fields where there's a lot of skill building involved. We tend to want to think that, if I'm a writer, I found my voice, but we think less about what were the specific things that people did that helped us along. The other thing that I think it's important for us to realize is that mentors are not all seen and heard. So a lot of things that were done for me, I didn't realize until years later, because the people who did them didn't really make a point of letting me know that they had done it. And so that part of it, I think, is also important, that the formal structures of mentoring, we can and have to do a much better job of. But the most part of, I think, the informal pieces that are also really important is just getting students to feel comfortable with introducing themselves, with coming back. And when something negative happens, being brave enough to speak up and say, that wasn't positive for me. Here's how I interpreted what you said. And I find, in essentially every case, the faculty member who did a poor job in the mentoring is shocked. They had they're completely ignorant of how what they said came across. And I believe them, right? I don't believe that they were evil, or that they were expressing extrinsic prejudice, but there can be some intrinsic bias. And it comes out in ways that, again, we're just not thinking. And so one part of helping get better mentors is again, to have those who need the mentoring to kind of recognize that, first of all, we need it all the way through, right? It doesn't stop as an undergraduate, a graduate student, as a assistant professor, or even as an associate professor with tenure. We all still need to have someone to reflect our ideas against, someone to encourage us when we tend to, not want to move forward on something as quickly as we should. And we all need to basically remind ourselves that it's the collective effort that makes it possible for our fields to advance, right? I mean, we do have the very odd individuals, in physics, there's an Einstein every century or so. But really, the field advances by virtue of the fact that there's a collective that talks to each other, encourages each other, helps each other. And being more aware of that as you come into the field would be, I think, just so much to the good for no matter what the field is, to actually understand that. And so these fields that haven't really come to this, or that have come to it very recently, I think are just starting to realize that they've missed out on a lot by not doing that, right? And so when I talk to medieval linguists, that's one of the fields that just in the last few years has realized that, the medieval times didn't just occur in Europe. They were also taking place in South America and Africa. And there were actually interactions among all those three regions, which were really relevant to the study, that has been ignored because scholars were so focused on just, the idea of the tradition within the field. And it's only the people who are breaking traditions who are really making new forays, and also making, by the way, that subject of more interest to students who are in the college today, right? Teaching to the 2 or 3 that want to major in this anymore just is not good justification for maintaining your scholarly excellence. Very interesting, because the assumption is that it is about initiatives. And before taking the job, the last interview I had, which is with the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, was precisely on that question, which is, what do you expect will be different 3 years after I take this position? And I was not going to take it if it was going to be, we expect that there are a bunch of documents written and web pages development and initiatives produced. And it's not that I think those are bad, I don't, but initiatives in and of themselves don't change the norm. It's possible they can, but everyone looks at them as being something that is supported during the time that the people who have the resources to support it are behind it. And if they change their mind and move on to something else, or if they leave their position and go on to bigger and better things, then the initiatives in and of themselves, in most cases, haven't had the chance to be established. So when I say initiatives are not something that I came to produce, what I came to do was to change conversations and to make sure that there were more conversations and in venues where they didn't exist before, which I think is much more important for talking about what new normal looks like than initiatives. So that's something that's really, it's still a question that I get from faculty, which is, where's the money that supports recruitment of graduate students? Where's the money that allows us to have more faculty? Yale still uses the slot system. So before I leave this position, that's one thing I definitely want to kill. But the idea is that there are a designated number of slots for each department, and where's the ones that are diversity slots. And so a lot of these conversations that I have start around the fact that I would not have come to Penn on a diversity slot. I wouldn't have come to Yale on a diversity slot. I understand why people think that those are important, but in reality, we spend, like any other university, an awful lot of money recruiting faculty, recruiting graduate students, recruiting postdocs. I don't see that we need more money to recruit a population that looks anything different than the current population or past populations, right? You can redirect, if you want to call it that, the same resources, but wouldn't it be better if your hiring processes and your recruitment processes and your retention processes just treated people the same? And if that were the case, I don't know why we would need slots or designated programs which are intended to bring people in, when our whole goal really is around being more inclusive. The idea that, all right, well, we should have an initiative around inclusivity, I can absolutely understand that that's something that is easy to remind people about, right? So we have this initiative. So be nice, be kind, be mindful of how you talk to people, what you say to them. But again, I think that's really a talking point, right? The reality is that we want people to just understand that the way that they've been ignoring things in the past are not ways that you could ignore them going forward. Otherwise, no initiative in the end really works. And so I remind people of something that they do know very well, which is that in the early 2000s, from 2000 to 2006, Yale did have quite a lot of success at recruiting Black faculty. Didn't do so well with Indigenous, with BIPOC in general, but with African Americans, there was a surge. When I arrived, not one of those faculty remained. So it stopped in 2008 with the onset of the reality of financial support, which is you don't have the ability to simply tell every department to go out and find faculty and recruit them. And so once that stopped, then everything reverted back to what it had been in the past. And ultimately, every one of those African-American faculty left. So the result was zero, right? You'd had this build up, if you describe it just in terms of numbers, and it didn't work to change the place because none of Yale that was really important to keep those people here actually remained once the focus from whatever the initiative was no longer there. So I'm very mindful that when I say, here are the things that we're doing, I don't describe them in terms of initiatives, right? So the hiring process is changed for faculty. There are 11 steps that you must go through, a department must go through from the time you think that you want to have a new faculty member in a particular position to the actual hiring of the faculty member. The person in my position must sign off on 9 of those. So if you want to propose to the dean to have a new faculty position, I advise the dean along with a set of other faculty who are asked to look at what the department is planning to do to make sure that whoever comes into this position is going to thrive. So for me, there must be a plan for why you expect to improve the diversity of the applicant pool and how you would actually have the ability to promote this person, assuming that they are successful in their research and their teaching. So that has to exist or you don't get the approval in the first place. I have to sign off on the search committee members along with the divisional dean. I have to sign off on having met with the entire search committee, or at least as much of the search committee as we can get together, not simply the diversity rep, to again understand that here's the diversity plan. I understand that the department chair wrote this, and it may well be that nobody else in the department has even seen it. But this is what you agreed to, whether you know it or not. The representative of your department presented it. And it's great if it came from this committee, but whether it did or not, you have to be willing to say how you're going to carry out the things that are mentioned in the plan. I sign off on the short list before anybody gets invited. So anyway, we could call that an initiative, but in reality, there was a new position. It didn't exist before. And from the dean's office, we just inserted those steps. Okay. So when we talk about what are we doing for making sure that we are having a broader network among our faculty, pretty much the people who are at Yale and have been for a while know people who go to places like Yale and work at places like Yale, right? And so I don't expect that they would even be familiar with a lot of researchers at, say, Georgia Tech, but certainly not at an LSU or Prairie View A&M. And so once we're able to get past the COVID era where people can travel again, the faculty will be offered incentives that if you go to, say, Penn to give a colloquium or a seminar, Lincoln University is 35 miles to the west. So we will pay for an extra night of hotel and travel, and I can help with arranging who to talk to at Lincoln. So you can just go and you can give the same talk if you want. It actually doesn't matter how good the talk is. It would be great if you put effort into making it accessible and interesting, but in reality, just the interest that you show and getting your name and getting Yale's brand known in these places as a place that's actually interested in looking at students from this So I don't refer to that as an initiative, but we have the money to actually support that. I don't have a budget, but if anybody comes to me and says, I have an idea for something that costs a few $1,000s to do, which I think will improve our sense of inclusion within the community, I find a way to fund it, right? And so there's not a pot of money that you apply for, but if you come to me and say, here's an idea, and it's a new idea, then we'll do it, right? We'll just find a way. I mean, I have to be convinced that you can, but for example, I've had graduate students come to me and say, look, we've made, the faculty hasn't been that interested, but we've made inroads into minority serving institutions where we just want to have the introduction, in this case of psychology, neuroscience, Gabe, is one aspect of it, but basically everything from nerves to behavior, right? We just want to introduce students in their junior year to what's happening, not necessarily just at Yale, but just what's happening in the field. That's very interesting to try and get more interest among them in graduate study. And so, yeah, sure, we can spend $15,000 to just provide the travel budget, right? But you have to do all the work to actually get the students recruited and bring them here. So again, I don't refer to those as initiatives. They're just, here's what should have been the norm all along. And so if it sounds like something that we should be doing, let's just decide to do it rather than say we're doing it under the rubric of something that could go away at some point.